Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. Today is a fun day. We're going to do just Q&A. Q&A about evolution. So if you have questions about the process of evolution in particular, a lot of the details like what date a certain species was alive, those sorts of things I'd have to look up. But things on the process of evolution, questions that you might have, things you might have heard, I will do my best to answer all of the questions that you might have. So let me just I got a couple of little welcome chats here already. Let's see. Rahini asks, is Jackson 13 now? Yeah, I think he is 13. He might be 14. I actually haven't seen him in a little bit. He's over in Oregon, and I'm now here in Montreal. But yeah, I did a series of videos with my nephew Jackson, and about the skulls of Peru, the supposed alien skulls of Peru, and I'm actually getting ready. I might make a couple more of those videos and put them up on my main channel, the Stated Clearly channel. So that'll be cool. For your evolution questions, if you can do @stated space casually, I will be able to see those. They'll pop up in orange for me here. But it looks like we already have one from Tom Hools. Do chimps ever get born with a tail like humans sometimes do? I'm actually not sure. I imagine that they would. I mean, it happens sometimes in humans, so I'm assuming it would happen in chimps as well. But we really don't. I mean, the number of chimpanzees alive today is tiny compared to the number of humans. And, most of them live in the wild. So I don't know that that's ever been documented. But, I mean, certainly, if it can happen to us, it can happen to them. Can you make a video on evolutionary stable strategy? That would be a good thing to do sometime. An evolutionarily stable strategy is one that works in the long run, and so it doesn't tend to change. And evolution will pull things towards stable strategies within a specific environment. So yeah, doing a whole video on that would be interesting. There's a lot of really this is really important when it comes to relationships between different organisms when they get locked into symbiosis. And also it's really important in signaling theory. So when different organisms start communicating with each other, if they are dishonest in their signaling. So there's an example of this with fiddler crabs. Fiddler crabs, the males will grow these giant arms that they use for fighting. And sometimes if their arm gets ripped off, they'll regrow a new one really quickly that's not strong at all, but it looks big and strong. And so they're lying. They're being dishonest. It's a dishonest signal. They cannot actually win a fight with it. And that's not a very evolutionarily stable strategy, because if everybody starts doing that, then the signal loses its validity, loses its strength, and individuals will start to call the bluff. But if there's low enough dishonest signaling in a population, it can actually be evolutionarily stable at a certain limit. So it's a really interesting concept that we see happening in biology here. I had on Twitter and on Facebook, I had posted letting people ask questions ahead of time, and one question that I got, and by the way, I'll be addressing your questions here too, but one question that I got ahead of time was, why did we evolve soft skin? Humans have very soft skin. This question came from Marilyn, who is a nurse, and also my wife. She was the first person to ask a question. She had a little bit of a heads up on this, but she's a nurse and she sees people come in with injuries, and quite often, and it seems almost dangerous that we have skin that's as soft as it is. When we're trying to answer a question as to why something evolved, it's actually really, really tricky to figure this out, to answer these why questions. What we really want to know when we're asking that is, what selection pressures selected for, in this case, soft skin. And that is extremely difficult to figure out. We also need to know, what was the condition before soft skin existed that was there. What was the precursor to that? And the best way to try and start answering these types of questions, these why questions, is to ask just what is the function of soft skin. And it's an interesting to try and think about. I mean, having soft skin gives us the ability to have sensory receptors all over our bodies. If you look at a crab, for example, covered in a hard exoskeleton, they have trouble sensing the world. They have to actually have little holes that are poked in their exoskeleton where soft tissue can come out a little bit and act as a sensor to either taste their surroundings or to feel their surroundings. And they also have really thin hair-like protrusions that come out of their exoskeletons that allow them to feel. Those can get bent, and that can act as a sensory mechanism. But there are all sorts of problems that you have when you have really tough outer shell that we just don't have. We can sense everything, and it's amazing. And I imagine that for whatever reason was more of an advantage for most animals on land, because most animals on land have quite a bit of soft skin. Of course, you've got reptiles and so on that have scales, but between those scales, usually, except for in the case of snakes and a few lizards that are really covered in scales, usually there's a lot of more sensitive skin between those scaled sections. And then, so we can think that maybe, one of these selection pressures was for being able to sense our surroundings better. It seems that soft skin evolved in mammals that were covered in hair, hair is also very protective, sort of like scales. Not nearly as protective as scales, but it is very protective. And then humans lost hair probably after we started using clothing, after we started using some sort of covering to protect our bodies. And the reduction of hair, again, it's one of these why questions that's hard to figure out why. Several things have been suggested for that. One is that the loss of hair helps us with parasites. If you look at chimpanzees, for example, they're constantly grooming, they're constantly pulling parasites out of each other and out of themselves. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of energy expended, which we don't have to do because it's so easy to find a parasite on our body. We don't have hair. And then the other thing that's been proposed is that we went through a semi-aquatic stage where we were maybe feeding in tide pools and things like that a lot. And during that semi-aquatic stage, a reduction in hair helped us swim better. A lot of people say there's not good evidence for that, but so we've got this strange evolutionary history. We are mammals. Mammals tend to have soft skin. There are a few exceptions. There are some scaled mammals, armadillos and so on, and pangolins. But for the most part, mammals are protected by their fur, and they have soft skin underneath, and we then lost that fur. I would like to point out that we have a really beautiful adaptation in our skin where when we're being rough on a patch of skin, a particular patch of skin, we will grow keratinized sections. So this will actually create a bunch of cells, fill them with keratin. Those cells will die and they'll become a shield. So if you play guitar a lot, you'll get these really strong calluses on the tips of your fingers. If if you're a welder, if you work a lot with metal, with wood, you're going to develop really strong calluses on your hands and so on. And so we're actually pretty dang efficient at protecting ourselves through this, what's normally pretty soft skin. And a lot of the injuries that you see that we're getting are because we're doing crazy things, like we're riding motorcycles and we fall, and that rips right through our skin. We are, riding bikes and skateboards and driving around in cars. So a lot of the things that we do that really do mess up our skin, it's because we're doing these new weird things that we did not actually do in our evolutionary history when our soft skin became the norm. So, okay, getting lots of questions here. I've got a question from Oxage, and hopefully, am I saying your name right? Oxage. He says he's 11 years old, and he asks about the microbes found in Antarctica Lake. They seem very different. I actually do not know about these microbes found in Antarctica Lake. I do know that we've been finding microbes in glaciers, and that had just been frozen for, long periods of time. And as those glaciers thaw out, those things are getting released again, and some of them might even be able to be revived and live their lives again. So it's kind of like Jurassic Park. We're bringing these fossils back to life accidentally by thawing out the glaciers. That's really all I know about that situation, though. Garav asks, how do we know that all life on Earth had a single point of origin, and why is that? That's a good question. So there are, when we think about the origin of life, the origin of life is not solved, but there are reasons to believe that the origin of life is something that's obviously it's rare. Like, as far as we know, life only exists on Earth. But there are reasons that physicists are starting to tell us that if life evolved here, it's probably evolving elsewhere as well. And if conditions on Earth were so good for life to evolve once, it probably should have emerged more than once. Now, the reason that you wouldn't really see life emerge now, de novo, right, is because anything that's using biomolecules, and anytime the environment produces biomolecules on its own, those are going to get eaten by something. Like, all the organisms that exist right now, they have a huge head start on anything new that's starting to come into existence. So it's kind of like new life forms cannot evolve now for the same reason that a new search engine cannot overthrow Google. Google is, in the beginning of this whole search engine thing, you had Yahoo, you had Google, you had there's a bunch of other ones. Microsoft has their versions. I don't even remember what they are now, but Google just dominated the search engine world because they, for whatever reason, they got a head start, and they ended up just beating out the competition early on, and they took over everything. And now no one who wants to start a search engine has a prayer of beating out Google. They're just this giant, really efficient industry now. It's super hard to compete with them, and it's the same situation for new life forms that would be popping into existence now. Like, as soon as you start getting these biomolecules that are similar to life will eat them and assimilate them into their own bodies. And we think that something very similar happened early on in the origin of life. One or a few organisms dominated, and nothing else could really compete afterwards. There are three domains of life. So we have bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. And you can sort of think of those as three sort of independent origins. Eukaryotes are a little bit different, but archaea and bacteria might have been separate origins of life, but they were able, early on, they would have been swapping genes kind of willy-nilly. So you would have these cells that are compartments, and genes can be held inside of them, and there was a lot of horizontal gene transfer. So the big difference between Archaea and bacteria, the big difference is in their ribosomes. The ribosomes, which is the structure that builds protein, is significantly different in the two, but it's identical at its core. So the very core of the ribosome is identical even in bacteria and Archaea, and it's identical also in eukaryotes. We are eukaryotes. These more complex cells that have we're multi-celled organisms, but there's single-celled eukaryotes as well that are just, they've got a nucleus and they've got mitochondria and so on. And the main reason that we think that everything either came from two origins that ended up swapping a lot of genes early on, or just one origin and it split early on, is because the genetic code is the same, close to the same in all organisms. And the ribosome at its core is identical, almost atom per atom at its core in all organisms. And the chances of that happening twice just randomly is pretty much zero. So we think that we think because of those two things that there was either a single origin or multiple origins, but one ribosome, that the genes for that ribosome ended up dominating all of these cells that exist. And so that's why we have these very, very similar ribosomes in all organisms. So either a single origin or multiple organisms with a quick takeover, sort of like, and with Yahoo and Google and all of these other search engines, you had one that ended up dominating and it just took over everything. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see. Shad asks, what is the best simple way to explain evolution to someone? Well, I would recommend sharing with them the Stated Clearly animations. The reason that I started Stated Clearly, which is my other channel where I do these animations about how evolution works, genetics and evolution, the reason that I started that is because I was having trouble explaining evolution to friends of mine. I was living in Tennessee when I first got the idea to do this, and my friends there were very much against evolution, and they were also not really willing to read a whole textbook on it. And my favorite lessons on evolution it was a series of videos by Richard Dawkins called, I think it's like Growing Up Universe or something like that. But it's really great if you can find it. It's a series of talks that he did early on in his career. It was like young Dawkins. And it was kind of before he'd gone all, full atheist and started his atheist project. But he does this really great series on, it's on genetics and evolution, but it's peppered with little insults at Christianity. It was kind of like a little preview of what was to come in Dawkins' career. And because of that, when I would show it to people, they didn't like it. And so I wanted to start something that was similar in its simplicity to that little series, but was just friendly, a lot more friendly, and just talked about, what evolution is and how it works. So I started this channel, the Stated Clearly channel, and those videos really are designed to teach someone, to share evolution with someone who's really new to it and maybe even reluctant to understand how it works. So that's kind of a good starting point. So self-promotion as well. But Andrew asks, can you explain what is meant by information? Creationists often state evolution cannot add information. So what is information and how is it added? So genetic information. This word information is used differently by different people, and it can be very, very confusing. A physicist will say that all matter contains information about itself. So if a bus that's driving down the road contains information about its size, about its mass, about its trajectory. And if you get hit by that bus, that information is immediately transferred into your body. There's parts of that information, things about its mass and its speed that gets instantly transferred into your body, and information about your body gets transferred into that bus. So that's how physicists think about information. But genetic information is different than just basic physical information. Genetic information is information that exists and that is shared in what really can be described as a communication system that exists between the genome and the ribosome. The ribosome is the structure that I was talking about earlier. It reads genes and takes that information and it uses that to build proteins. And things start to get weird for a lot of people when they hear about information and communication systems inside of cells. But there's no woo-woo here. Like everything, all communication systems really are physical at the core. Even a computer, you know, the code in your computer, the zeros and ones. We talk about it in zeros and ones, but it's actually running on a physical substrate. The zeros and ones, they're actually different voltages inside of a computer. So there's a physical basis for this information. And so information is not some magical, weird new thing outside of physics. It's a communication system that's set up. It has rules that govern it. And those rules have to come into existence. In the case of the genetic code, those rules came into existence through the process of evolution. And there is a field of evolutionary biology called the signaling theory, which explores how it is that signaling systems, communication systems, emerge between different entities that are under selection pressure to cooperate as they're evolving. And so signaling theory, if you want to look that up, I'm actually planning to do a whole series of videos on this, the origin of genetic information in the first place, and what we can learn about that from signaling theory. But it is quite a bit to wrap your head around when you're first starting. But in short, we have a really good understanding of how communication systems evolve. And as far as adding new information, so this thing that creationists say you cannot add new information, now that the genetic system already exists, adding new information, taking information away, editing information, all that happens through mutations. Mutations are what cause that. Some mutations are completely random. They're caused by the environment. Others, you wouldn't want to totally say are random, because like a HIV, for example, will insert its genome into your genome if it infects you. And it does that in a non-random way. It actually targets certain parts of your genome that are highly active. So when it gets into a cell, it has an enzyme that detects a certain enzyme that you use to take DNA and convert that into RNA, which is then used as a signal. And it wants its DNA. Well, once it inserts its genome into your genome, it wants to insert that into a spot that's being transcribed. And so it's got this enzyme that actually searches for a spot in your genome that's being transcribed, and it inserts itself in that spot. So this is a mutation. I mean, it's causing a permanent change in your genome, but it's an active process. This is an organism that's evolved to do this. It's actively. And so you can kind of consider that to be a random mutation, or you could consider that to be a function of this virus. But that's another case of a change in genetic information. In that case, it's a bad change. You now have HIV once that's inserted into your genome. But there are also other processes, like when you are reproducing, you have enzymes that have evolved to do this specifically. That you have enzymes that will align your chromosomes together when you're creating sperm cells or egg cells. And the chromosomes you got from your mother and the chromosomes you got from your father, they will all match up and they will swap chunks. And that's a genetic shuffling mechanism that actually causes mutations. But those are caused, you could say, deliberately by these enzymes that are actively causing those mutations. So there's a lot of ways that information is changed, edited. There are deletions of of genetic information. There are insertions of genetic information. And over on the Stated Clearly channel, I have a series of videos. I think it's a 3-part series on how new genetic information evolves. So you can go check that out. And I give a bunch of really specific examples of new genetic information that we've actually observed happen. So we've observed we've observed this happening in the lab with bacteria and so on. And then we've observed it sort of in hindsight with dogs. So there's certain mutations that we know happened after dogs were domesticated. And I give some examples of some which are really long gene duplications and that really lengthen the genome of the dogs that have that mutation. So go check that out. There are lots of ways that genetic information can be added, taken away, and edited through the normal process of evolution. And it's extremely well understood. So let's see. Sophia asks, how Lamarckian is epigenetics, really? How do acquired traits get into the germline? This is something that's not fully understood. So for those who aren't familiar with these terms, Lamarckian and epigenetics, so Lamarck was before Darwin, and he proposed that, the idea of evolution, the idea that of common ancestry was actually, it predates Darwin by a long time. The ancient peoples were talking about common descent, that humans somehow came from other animals, that we are animals and that we came from other animals. People have been talking about that for a long time. Scientists in Darwin's time, so naturalists, were talking about it as well. And Lamarck was one of these people who was talking about it. And he proposed this idea that the mechanism for evolution, that as an organism strives to better survive in its environment, it will, he gave the example of a giraffe trying to reach really high will eventually grow its neck a little bit longer, and its children will have their necks grow a little bit longer. And so there's this sort of intentional striving that was causing evolution to happen. And Darwin proposed a very different idea, which is that the changes that happen in evolutionary time are essentially random. They're not, you can't will yourself to grow taller, to grow a longer neck. But when you have offspring, some of them will naturally have longer necks than others. And if there is selection pressure for having a long neck, those ones with the longer neck will be more likely to survive and reproduce. If the food is up high, those with longer necks are going to be more likely to be successful. And so those are two pretty different ideas, right? That the organism is striving to survive, and that it somehow wills itself to grow a longer neck, versus this is happening naturally and then being selected either for or against as the generations move forward. We have this thing called epigenetics, this phenomena that we've found. And even talking about epigenetics, epi just means on top of. So that there are things that control our phenotype, the way that our bodies behave and are shaped, that don't have anything to do directly with our genetics. They're controlled by epigenetic factors. So these proteins and structures that sit on top of our genome can actually change which genes get used and which genes get turned on, which ones get turned off at different times. And epigenetics it's really important for the development of your body. So when you start out, you have these cells that are basically universal cells, these stem cells that are not specialized. And as you begin to develop, epigenetics kicks in and turns off certain genes and turns on different genes in different cell tissues. So your eyeball cells have the same genome, the same genetic sequence as your bone cells, but different genes are turned on and different genes are turned off in your eyeball cells versus your bone cells, and that's why they behave differently. So usually when we're talking about epigenetics, we're talking about this process that happens, these proteins that run on top of the genome and turn things on and turn things off. Those proteins are made by the genome. I mean, the genome is what tells the ribosome which proteins to build. So really the epigenetic system, it comes from the genes, but it can then do some controlling over which genes get turned on and which genes get turned off. And we've realized recently that sometimes these epigenetic messages can actually be passed from parent to child. It appears. So people who have PTSD can sometimes, it seems, can pass that on to their children. And you might think, oh, that's horrible. You're born with PTSD. You're just high strung and super stressed. And in most cases today, that is a horrible adaptation, the ability to pass on your extreme phobias to your offspring. And by the way, it's fairly controversial as to whether or not this really is being passed on to offspring. It's not fully understood, but it seems right now that it might be happening. But in an environment where if you go to war and you experience extreme PTSD, and then the war is over, having extreme PTSD is now a huge disadvantage for you. But during the war, being really jumpy and having these phobias was not a disadvantage. That was actually an advantage for you. To be on edge constantly, it's super stressful, but it's an advantage for you when you're in a war zone. And organisms find themselves in new environments that are more dangerous or less dangerous all the time, and usually the danger exists for multiple generations. So it actually makes sense, if you're in a highly stressed environment, to somehow pass that on to your offspring so that they're also on edge as soon as they're born. A lot of animals just hit go at the start, right? They don't. Humans are special that we go through this, we're at home until we're 18 or so. That's not usual for organisms. They don't get to learn from their parents. It's information needs to be passed on in the genome, right? So this is actually, there's an evolutionary reason, there's evolutionary logic tells us that this adaptation, the ability to pass on information about how stressful the environment is to your offspring, that actually makes sense, an adaptation like that. And the question is, could epigenetic information like this end up permanent in the genome and actually cause long-term evolutionary change? And the answer is, we don't know what the mechanism would be, except for the fact that if you are in a constant state of stress because of an epigenetic change for multiple generations, all of your genes are going to be under a new pressure of this high stress environment to adapt to that high stress environment and do things differently in that high stress environment. So there is kind of a way where an epigenetic effect, if it persists long enough, it could cause actual genetic evolutionary change. It could actually select for traits that are different than the traits it would be selected for without that long-term epigenetic change. So, there is this way in which an epigenetic change, if it lasts long enough, if it's reinforced long enough, could actually end up resulting in genetic changes over evolutionary time indirectly. So that there's really no argument that can happen. Like, obviously, if the epigenetic effect lasts long enough and is reinforced consistently long enough, you are going to get different traits selected for, different mutations will be selected for than if that epigenetic effect was not there. That's not really controversial. But we don't know of a direct mechanism that an epigenetic change can directly edit or modify the genome. That's just not something that we've discovered yet. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see, where am I at here? Pitsy or Pizzi asks, I never understood how sex evolved. I get the benefits, but not the specifics in how meiosis could develop, because you need two halves to join, and you need the cell to only sometimes do meiosis and most of the time mitosis. I have to run, so I'm leaving the question here, and I'll watch it later for the answer. Thanks. I've gone over that in my last Q&A, actually, a little bit, but let me just go over here again. So the question of meiosis and mitosis being two different processes, that is actually not at the origin of sexual reproduction. The first organisms that were reproducing sexually were single-celled organisms, and they really only did one or the other. Well, you can actually get blended versions of these. So the origin of sexual reproduction is not super well understood. However, we do know that lots of organisms swap genes with each other, and sexual reproduction is just a really fine-tuned version of gene swapping. So bacteria, they swap genes with each other. They will do what's called conjugation, and one bacterial cell will part of its cell wall, or part of its membrane will extend into the other bacteria, and they will actually swap genes through a channel that develops between the two. And that's kind of like a really simplified version of sexual reproduction. And we think that sexual reproduction emerged from a system like this, just gene swapping taken to an extreme. So in sexual reproduction now, we perfectly swap versions of our genomes with each other. We have matching chromosomes, and those chromosomes get swapped and aligned. And we do this, it's a gene shuffling process that happens. And we think that that's how it emerged, through simpler versions of that we see in bacteria and other organisms. And the question now is, why are so many organisms dependent on sexual reproduction? There are lots of organisms that can only reproduce sexually. There are lots that can reproduce without gene swapping also. So they can do either or. They can just clone themselves over and over and over again, and then they'll swap genes when they have the opportunity. And then there are organisms like us. We are obligate sexual reproducers, and it's not clear if that obligate sexual reproduction was specifically selected for, like natural selection favored that, or if we simply lost the ability to clone ourselves, and we lost that ability over evolutionary time, and we then became completely dependent on sexual reproduction. That's not fully clear, but there are lots of benefits to sexual reproduction that you don't get through cloning. You can get rid of negative mutations. Negative mutations happen more often than beneficial mutations, and you can actually weed those out through sexual reproduction, because you're constantly shuffling your genome, and some of your offspring are going to get all of your good chromosomes, all of your good genes. Some offspring will get a group of bad genes, and this is a way to it's a way to purge these bad mutations, and it avoids what's called Mueller's ratchet, which is this accumulation of negative mutations that can cause an extinction in a really complex organism. So the more complex an organism is, the more likely mutations are to be negative instead of beneficial. And so sexual reproduction enables us to purge ourselves of these negative mutations as time goes on, in a way that organisms that just clone themselves, they can't do that. So there are lots of benefits to it. The other benefit to it is that your entire population is going to be genetically diverse, which means it's harder for a parasite to take over, because each individual in the population, their bodies are significantly different, to where it makes it difficult for an organism to adapt and be able to spread through a population. There's certain individuals that they just cannot infect. And we see this with the Black Plague, for example. we see that some people were just immune to it because the Black Plague just couldn't, their bodies were different enough that it could not infect them. And we're probably seeing this with the virus right now that's going through our population. There are people that are not heavily affected by it, and this seems to have more to do with age than your genetics. But people that have mutations on the ACE2 receptor that this virus exploits, those people are actually we probably will find eventually people that are completely immune to this virus because they have a different version of that gene. They have a mutation in that gene that makes it so that the virus cannot infect them. So sexual reproduction, it has a lot of different functions. And we think that natural selection either favored those so much that it got rid of the ability for mammals to clone themselves, or it's also possible that mammals just lost that ability throughout evolutionary time and we're stuck with sexual reproduction now forever. So that actually does happen in evolution quite often. And it's unclear as to which one of those things happened. Tim Smith. How did Homo sapiens' skin color change from darker to lighter, and why? Well, it only changed in certain populations, right? There's a whole variety of skin pigment variations that exist in different human populations, and you're asking why. You're asking how and why. So, how, if you look at a skin cell, the pigment of a skin cell is produced by a series of enzymes that produce the pigments that are in our skin. And if you look at the cell, those pigments are covering the nucleus. They're sheltering the nucleus from sunlight, from UV radiation. And in areas that have lots of UV radiation, mutations that increase the ability to make skin pigments have been selected for. So in populations that have lived in really high radiation environments, they're going to have darker skin by default. And then in environments where there is less radiation, you're going to have, you tend to see populations that have lived there for a long time will have lighter pigment. And that's controlled by a bunch of different genes. There are lots of genes involved in skin color. So it's actually hard to just look at someone's genome and figure out how dark their skin would be or how light their skin would be, because there are so many different genes involved. But yeah, we have lots of different. There are two main pigments. There's a it's almost like a black one, and then there's a red one, and there's combinations of that give different skin colors that we see in different human populations. And so the how of that is that you either produce more or less of these pigments, and you either produce more of the red one or more of the black one. So that's how skin color changes, and genes that control this. And then also, of course, we have the ability to create more pigment when we are exposed to light. So there's a mechanism where when we're exposed to skin damage from UV radiation, we start to build more pigments in our skin cells, so we get a suntan. And your other question was, hold on, I just lost the whole question here. So why did it change? What selection pressures? The selection pressure is UV radiation. So there's a bunch of vitamins that we produce, and we need UV radiation penetrating our cells to produce those vitamins. So there's a lot of different chemical reactions that happen inside of our cells that we need sunlight or light of some kind to facilitate. And we found that we think that natural selection is really favoring it's favoring this more than it's selecting against cancer. So early on, we thought that maybe dark skin is darker skin when there's more UV radiation is an adaptation to prevent skin cancer. but we actually think that the selection pressure is stronger on these vitamin processes. And to create these vitamins, so vitamin D, I believe, is one of them, that's produced in the skin and requires sunlight or bright light to be penetrating the cells in order for vitamin D to be produced. And this is really important especially for mothers and for young children, that they're able to produce these vitamins in high quantities so that they can grow and develop. And if there's not enough sunlight or if there's not enough light penetrating the cells, you can't produce vitamin D efficiently. And if there's too much sunlight penetrating cells, you also can't create vitamin D efficiently. And so we think that vitamin D and other chemical reactions that we need to perform in our cells that use light, we think that those reactions are what's selecting for skin pigment, how pigmented we are in different populations. Now, of course, with traveling, we screw that all up. So people who have historically adapted to their specific environment with different skin colors, those no longer really work so well because we now live everywhere. And that's why it's, we're finding that it's important to take supplements and to get a lot of these vitamins from your diet. And luckily, with modern technology and modern farming practices, we can ship different foods that are rich in these vitamins all over the place. And we don't have to live with these deficiencies, even if we now live in an environment that doesn't really jive with our skin pigments so well. So okay. Aksaj asks or says, we have hard skin on our feet and on our palms. We have them because those areas are important to keep safe. Yeah, that's true. We have the skin on the palms of our feet, palms of our hands, and the bottoms of our feet tend to be harder than the rest of our body because those are the parts that we use. And this happens through just use. So we have this ability to create keratinized cells when those parts of our bodies are being used, but also there are the skin on our palms is actually there's a little bit more padding on our hands and on our feet than normal. And there's actually a mutation you can get that will give you extreme padding on your hands and feet. And it's a problem for people who have this mutation now because it makes it really hard to use cell phones. You can't feel very well. It makes it so that your sense of touch is quite dramatically diminished. But you have these really great pads on your hands and feet. And I met a girl that has this mutation, and she was telling me about it. Like for her, it's, when she was younger, it was really embarrassing, but now she's over it. But it's the frustration of not being able to use a cell phone very well, not being able to type on a cell phone. It's just super frustrating for her. But it was interesting talking to her about that. Let's see. True Indian Giorno asks, what type of life can be on Jupiter's moon, Europa? Can you make some guesses? So we think that Europa might be capable of producing life on a very different chemistry than what we have here on Earth. And I don't know the details about that enough to really comment. But I know that we are sending a probe there to see if life does exist, because that would be really cool, because it's going to be based on a very different chemistry. I think it's supposed to be not water-based life, but I believe it's still carbon-based, but not water-based. But I could be wrong on that, so don't quote me on that. But yeah, that's interesting. I don't know enough about it to really say much. Aaron Miller, do you know of any examples of studies done in different fields of research whose findings overlap to support the current model of evolution? Well, yeah, I mean, evolution is studied by biologists, obviously, and then different groups of biologists. So you've got paleontologists that are studying the fossil record. You have geneticists that are studying genetics. And these are really different, very, very different fields of research. I mean, a geneticist usually doesn't know hardly anything about the fossil record. And this is actually a problem. You see conclusions being made in genetics that are just not even accounting for what we see in the fossil record. And they're proposing, they'll propose little ideas, and people in the fossil record are shaking their heads like, no, you don't understand. This has already been solved a long time ago in the fossil record, and then the paleontology literature. Just look there, we already solved this problem. But then you also see people like physicists are also studying biology and evolution. You have like Schrödinger, who wrote a lot about biology. And we've got physicists that are looking at evolution from the perspective of physics and the perspective of energy flow. It turns out that what biology is doing is what organisms are doing is they're finding ways to absorb energy. They're really efficient at absorbing energy. And so physicists study this. And what is natural selection doing? It's making things better and better at absorbing energy in the environment and using that, and really speeding up the process of entropy. Organisms, you have a local reduction in entropy at the organism level, and a broad increase in entropy at a broader level if you zoom out. And organisms they're just absorbing and using energy and getting better and better at doing that. That's what natural selection is selecting for, is this ability to absorb energy more efficiently. And so that's really interesting. You're starting to see physicists that are studying biology from this thermodynamic perspective. So yeah, it's happening all over the place. Tom Hools, what is your favorite museum on evolution? My favorite museum, because I love whales, is actually a tiny little museum at the College of Charleston that talks about whale evolution. So if you ever go to Charleston, go to the College of Charleston and go check out their little tiny whale museum. It's absolutely great. And if you catch them at the right time, they'll take you behind the scenes and show you their research and stuff. So that's really cool. My favorite natural history museum would be the one in London, like the original giant natural history museum there. There's also a really cool one at Oxford. And that's kind of where the Natural History Museum concept was invented. It was in London. So go check that out if you can. That's like the original Natural History Museum in London there. And it's spectacular. It's like the most fancy cathedral you've ever seen, but it's just, instead of trying to be religious, it's just showing you how nature works. It's really, really cool. And that's where the concept comes from. It comes from the concept of these giant, magnificent cathedrals. Let's do this to highlight the beauty of nature. And that's what the Natural History Museum was. Let me get a drink of water here. Okay. In what order should I read Richard Dawkins' books? This is another question from True Indian Giorno. Well, it depends on kind of what level you're at. He's written he recently wrote a book that kind of gives an introduction to evolution, which is called like The Greatest Show on Earth, I think. Is that one? I have it somewhere. Somewhere I have it. I think it's in the other room. But that's a good one for an introduction to evolution. But if you're going to read any Dawkins book, I think you should read The Selfish Gene. There are parts of it that I think are starting to become a little bit less relevant, but he teaches you how to look at evolution from the perspective of a gene, and it's super important to understand how to do this. So, I would definitely read that one. So I don't really have an order that you should read things in, but definitely don't skip that one. That's a really good one. Let's see. I'm getting a lot of questions from the same people here, and I apologize for skipping stuff, but so True Indian Giorno has asked quite a few questions, and so let me try and get to someone else here. Aaron Miller, I've gone over a couple of yours as well too, so let me go to Shad. Okay, let's see. Aj Rana asks, will we lose any finger or nails in the future? I mean, it's happened lots of times throughout evolutionary history. You have a reduction of fingers, or, yeah, I don't know of anything that's just completely lost its... no, birds. Some birds have no claws anymore on their wings. Chickens have one claw on their wing. Most chickens do. But a lot of birds don't have any claws on their wings anymore. The wing is a modified arm. There's actually 3 fingers inside of the wing. And then some birds still have 2 claws, like ostriches have 2 claws still. So they have the fingernail. A claw and a fingernail are the same thing. Just the claw is a fingernail that's bent around the finger and usually is curving. So ostriches still have 2, and then some birds have 0. So it's been lost in birds. It could definitely be lost in our future, I suppose. And we've had the reduction of fingers quite a few times, and an increase in finger number is fairly rare. You get it a lot in individuals. There's cats with 6 fingers. That's pretty common. And same with dogs. And you'll get humans every once in a while that have 6 fingers. But more often is throughout evolutionary time is the reduction of fingers. The first tetrapods had, I think it was 8 fingers is what we started with. The really early tetrapods. But for whatever reason, that number was reduced to 5. And after it was reduced to 5, we had the big radiation of vertebrates. So almost all vertebrates have 5 fingers and 5 toes. But then you see individual groups that have lost those, lost 1 or 2 or more of those toes. Horses have lost all of their toes except for they have a middle finger and they have a middle toe, and that's it. So they run around on their middle fingers. They're flipping you off all the time, and that's pretty interesting. And then you have like llamas; they only have 2. And so on. So yeah, the reduction has happened in other species. It could certainly happen in us as well. We don't really use our pinky fingers that much or our pinky toes that much, though I have heard that if you lose your pinky toe, it's a lot harder to balance. So yeah, it could happen. Shad, I'm having trouble with names, but Shad Manigat asks, are viruses linked to the tree of life? So we don't know exactly the origin of viruses is not fully understood. Like the origin of the first viruses is not fully understood, but they are definitely linked to the tree of life in that they actually kind of just cruise between branches in the tree of life. Viruses that will infect one species can hop over it and start infecting another species. And so their genome, which evolved, so like the current virus, for example, I don't want to say the name of it because then this video will get demonetized, but it's like, yeah, it's funny. You can't say the word or else you get demonetized, but the current virus that is infecting us right now, we think hopped over from bats. And so it was evolving within bats and adapting there, and then it hopped over to humans, possibly through pangolins. There is still a possibility that the transition happened in a laboratory. We don't think it was a designed weapon, but it is still possible that it happened in a laboratory. That's happened before. We've had lab leaks, and that hasn't been fully ruled out yet here. But what happens is that a virus that evolved in one organism then gets into a new organism and evolves and adapts in that one. And so you have this, they can actually even pull genes from one organism and accidentally insert them into another organism. So you do have this really weird way through viruses that evolution can actually hop from one branch of the tree to another branch of the tree in this sort of web-like manner. And so I like to imagine that the evolutionary tree with these little strings going all over the place to different branches, little spider webs, you could say, that kind of represent viruses. And we think that viruses actually, they first evolved by escaping organisms. So it was a cluster of genes that escaped its original organism. Other people think of viruses, maybe a different possible origin for viruses is that they are just extremely reduced parasites. So when a parasite really does good at infecting its host, oftentimes it'll start to lose traits, lose genes, and become more and more dependent on its host. It can't live freely anymore. And this may have happened to the point to where you have viruses that are just super simple organisms that cannot survive on their own at all. They need a host in order to reproduce. So that's one possible origin for viruses. And maybe both of these things happened in different cases. So viruses might have multiple origins. New viruses might be emerging now by the reduction of parasites. And new viruses might be escaping the genomes of their hosts. So yeah, the possibilities are endless there. But yeah, that's what they do in the tree of life. They hop around sort of like spider webs between branches. Richard Ball says, biology is messy. I prefer physics. Well, if you really dig down deep enough, biology is physics, right? And Richard Ball says, viruses have existed since the RNA world. That's actually, some viruses might have existed since the RNA world. I actually think that's pretty unlikely that something survived that long. But it's possible. That is one other explanation for their origin, but it's much more likely that the viruses that we're seeing now have evolved de novo since then. So through the reduction of a parasite into a virus, or through just the escape of a set of genes. Because we have jumping genes. We have there are genes that we have in our genome that can actually get into like ticks and stuff that bite us a lot. These jumping genes can get from us into the ticks and vice versa. Their jumping genes can get into us. And I've got a video on that called what is horizontal gene transfer on the Stated Clearly channel. So you can watch that. It explains how that happens. And a virus could evolve from a jumping gene, or quite easily, we think. Gadapurai Gotham asks, do we have any life hacks to study evolution from home using computational methods? You'd have to explain a little more. You can definitely study evolution in your own backyard. You can look at, different organisms, what they're doing now, and, do some comparative anatomy between different organisms there. So that works. But as far as computational methods, in order to do computation on evolution, you usually have to have lots and lots of data. So you would have to have lots and lots of data that you're collecting in your backyard before you can really run computations on that. Let's see. I'm getting some side conversation here. If you have a direct question, do @stated casually, and I'll see that highlighted in orange. I'm going to go back. Let's see. I'm seeing a couple. Okay, here we go. I was a little bit behind in the comments. Actually, I'm way behind in the comments. Let me try and get one that's been asked by someone new here. Gaurav Sharma asks, I would like to hear you talk about sexual orientation and why science has failed to present a solid theory yet. So maybe you're talking about the evolution of homosexuality. I think that, humans we're very sexual organisms, and most mammals are very sexual organisms, and most mammals they engage in sexual activities all the time that are not for reproductive purposes. They're for bonding purposes and just, getting out a little energy, apparently. I think the reason that we are more sexual than we need to be in order to reproduce is because that increases our chances at reproduction. So in general, organisms are more sexual than they need to be. They are driven to have more sex than they actually need to in order to reproduce. And in the case of homosexuality, I know a lot. I know several gay men, like fully gay, only attracted to other men, that have kids. So even though they are really only attracted to men, they still have had, they still have had partners and they've had kids with them, female partners. So I don't really know that homosexuality is being selected against very hard, because we are such sexually active organisms, sexually driven organisms, that we're still able to reproduce. Even if we are homosexual, we are able to reproduce. Even if we're exclusively homosexual, people still do it sometimes, kind of, even if they're not super into it. So because they want to have kids, and actually a lot of cases that I know, it was because they were pressured by their culture to get married, and so they did that and they had kids, even though it was not what was satisfying for them. But yeah, it happens. And then of course, whether or not you personally have kids, you can help raise kids, and that can be extremely beneficial for a population. And there are certain scenarios where survival is so difficult that it actually takes more than just two people to raise children. And in those cases, having exclusive homosexuality and a fairly high percentage of the population wouldn't be bad at all if those people are still participating in raising the children that are being produced in that population. So I don't think that homosexuality needs really its own special explanation. It's just we are hypersexual organisms, and the fact that homosexuality can persist makes sense because it's really not being selected against very hard. Let's see. Looking for more orange questions here from people who haven't asked already. We're at 12:08. I'm going to keep going here for another till 12:30 Eastern time. Let's see. Richard Ball, have you ever found something in your bio research that has made you think there is a major flaw in the theory of evolution, something magical? Well, there are lots of things, I suppose, that are hard to study. But there's nothing that's really, nothing would make me go towards magical thinking, because I don't tend that way anyways. But there are certainly things that are just mysterious. I mean, the origin of life hasn't been fully solved. And then there are things that are just difficult to understand, like the evolution of protein complexes is something that we haven't been able to study very well, because to study the origin of a structure, we have two ways to do it, really. You can look at the fossil record, and if the structure happens to be something that fossilizes well, you can get a picture of its development over time, that's the ideal way to do it. And then the other way to do it is through comparative anatomy. So if you're looking at a soft tissue, for example, you can look at the eyeball, like how did the eye evolve? You can compare different organisms, see what their eyes are like and what their functions are, and you can kind of get a picture as to how the eye evolved. And that's actually how we figured out how the eye evolved, is through comparative anatomy. But whenever you do that, when you're doing comparative anatomy alone, there's a lot of uncertainty there. Like the actual steps that our eyes went through, that we inherited our eyes from the vertebrates that came before us, the land vertebrates that came before us, the tetrapods, and they inherited their eyes from fish, which are also vertebrates, and they inherited their eyes from, simpler organisms that came before. But the specific steps in that are not well understood. So, because we can only do comparative anatomy, the eyeball does not fossilize well. But so we don't have as many steps as we would like with the evolution of the eye. So those things are difficult, and it's even more difficult when we're looking at protein structures, because those don't fossilize well either. But just recently, we have found this really cool way to revive extinct proteins by doing comparative genomics. We can actually take the genes from one organism that has a version of a protein that's very different than it is in a different organism, and we can combine those genomes and actually get what we think would be the ancestral protein to pop out, and we can study how it works. And this is being done now, like seriously, as a way to study the fossil record of protein structures, and it's really, really cool. There was a paper just recently on the evolution of hemoglobin that was published on this, and they did this we revived a fossil protein to study how it worked, and it's really cool. And I'm excited to see how this moves forward in the future to explain more things. So yeah, there are lots of things in biology that I wish we could understand better, but we can't because we don't have enough fossil data and so on. But we are now finding ways to get around some of these problems. So that's really cool. I'm getting the question, why don't creationists just stop and believe in science? Science has shown so many evidences. Most creationists do believe in science, just not the science of biology. So there's lots of creationists that are physicists. There's lots of creationists that are doctors and so on, that they'll study medical science, but they reject. They're pretty specific about what they reject. So the idea that creationists are anti-science in general, that's not super fair in many cases. They're just very specific. They reject the science of biology, particularly biological evolution. So, why don't we call theory of evolution as law of evolution? Is math involved in evolution? Yeah, math is involved in evolution, but theories and laws aren't the same thing. A law is just a theory is a broad idea that encompasses a bunch of data, a bunch of observations, and a bunch of laws. So a theory is a completely different thing from a law. And a law is just, we observe time and time again this one specific thing, and so we say that it's a law. But evolution is the theory of evolution is a broad explanation of how organisms evolve over time and diversified into the ways that they've diversified into now. It's not a law. It's a different thing than a law is. It's an overarching explanation that explains a bunch of laws and a bunch of observations that we have in physics and biology. Okay, moving on. Tim Smith asks, I've heard our modern species DNA is so very close with our biology. Do you have any ideas as to how this came about? Let's see. I've heard our modern species DNA is so very close within our biology. Do you have any ideas as to how this came about? I don't understand that question. Are you saying... Yeah, sorry. If you can rephrase that, I'll try and answer that again. I'm going to scroll up because there's a bunch of questions that I had skipped because they were asked by people who'd already asked some. So let me try and go back up to those. I'm getting questions about religion. I don't want to talk about those today. Let's see. Guarav asks, why didn't an unconquerable virus like HIV jump into humans much earlier and wipe us out? It's nearly impossible for a virus to cause the extinction of a species because the virus, first of all, the virus is evolution doesn't drive viruses to kill their hosts. In fact, evolution tends to drive viruses towards symbiosis with hosts and towards being benign within its host, because if it kills its host, it dies with that host, and it has to spread before the host dies. And if it's killing its host really quickly, well, spreading becomes really difficult, right? So, but even a virus that is selected to kill its host. So there are some cases where it spreads most vigorously when the host dies. This has been the case for Ebola in certain cultures because of the way that funerals work. Ebola will spread best at a funeral. And under situations like that, it's under selection pressure to kill. And let's just pretend that you could get a culture that was insisting upon having these really intense funerals where everybody would touch the body and get the disease, end up getting the disease, and the virus was able to just burn through the population, and it was selected to kill people faster, and so it was getting better and better at killing people, causing funerals, and then spreading. That virus would actually die out before it succeeded in completely killing a population, and the reason for that is that in every population there's always the few hermits that don't participate, and they don't like to participate in society, and they're going to be out far away, and they're not going to get infected with the disease for whatever reason. So the disease will actually die out by causing the extinction of the people that will easily catch it. It will die out before the species that it's infecting goes extinct. So you will have from these hermits, eventually they will revive the population, and you won't see the extinction of that species. And because of this, it's actually really hard for a virus to cause an actual extinction of a species, because every species you have just individuals that end up, in little pockets that are not connected to the rest of the population. And those little pockets just never get infected. And so the species never goes extinct because of that. Let's see. Also, of course, you can get hosts that will become immune to a virus, and so it's really hard for a virus to completely destroy a host species for multiple reasons. Okay. How did sperm and egg cells help a simple, like early microbes, multicellular system, and how did it help them exchanging genes like microorganisms? These cells have more problems. So the development of sperm and egg is a really interesting question, and it's been pretty well studied, but I don't think there's full consensus on why we have sperm and egg cells. So this question is there are a lot of things to this. We have sperm, which are extremely small, and then eggs, which are extremely large for a cell. And the sperm goes and finds the egg and fertilizes the egg. And so there is this division of labor that's happened between male and female. So the female produces this really strong egg full of protein and nourishment, these molecules that can really nourish the fetus as it develops. And the sperm cell has nothing but genes in it for the most part. And yeah, we think that's just a division of labor that evolved between organisms that were swapping genes with each other. You eventually get this division of labor where one benefits by doing all the work to find the egg cell, and one does all the work to build a nourishing environment for the fetus to grow. And yeah, there are equations that we run on natural selection that can explain why this division of labor developed, or how it can develop under certain selection pressures. And so all of that research is pretty interesting, but it gets pretty complex. But essentially, why do we have sperm and eggs? It's a division of labor so that one gamete can focus its energy on searching for the other gamete, and the other gamete can focus its energy on basically nourishing the fetus, which is going to develop from that gamete. Let's see. Okay. So Tim Smith is clarifying here. Steady casually. It's how extremely close our species' DNA is, closer than most other animals, such as chimpanzees' DNA, or more different than other chimpanzees in his area than humans are to humans. Okay, so if you look at two different humans, like really from really diverse different populations. So if you were to look at like an Australian Aborigine and compare their genome to like a Native American, for example. These are populations that have been separated for a long time, really long time, but their genomes are much more similar than what you'd find between two different chimps that live in the same jungle. So the reason for that is that we went through a much more recent bottleneck than chimpanzees have, genetic bottleneck. So our population went through some sort of we almost went extinct. The lineage that gave rise to humans, we went through a bottleneck where there was probably only a few thousand individuals that were in existence at that time, and that it reduced our genetic diversity, and we've been building that genetic diversity back up since then, and it just takes time. So that is why that's why we think that we are so similar to each other. True asks, why don't we have a definite distinction between genre, species, breed, subspecies in biology? Well, let's just talk about species, for example. It's super hard to define a species because these units aren't actually real. They're not real things that exist in the world. They're categories that humans invent. I mean, there's a sense in which they are real. Like humans and butterflies cannot successfully reproduce with each other. And so we are definitely different species, and we are not going to affect each other's evolution directly. However, there are ways in which a virus could actually transfer a gene from a butterfly into a human genome, and so we could actually end up starting to use that gene eventually. So there are kind of some ways in which the species are even blurred by viruses, but the for the most part, you can say that a species is a real thing in the fact that the human species cannot reproduce with the butterflies, a different butterfly species or a specific butterfly species. But the things start to get fuzzy if you look at like dogs and wolves, for example, or wolves and coyotes, for example. They can reproduce with each other sometimes, but they tend not to. It's super rare for a wolf and a coyote to reproduce together. And so biologists will say, oh, they're different species. It's so rare we can consider them to be different species because they don't really affect each other's evolution directly. There's not gene flow between wolves and coyotes. There's some gene flow, but not very much. So we consider them to be different species. But then when you look at bacteria have gene flow with pretty much any other species of bacteria. And so how we would define a species for an animal is different than how we'd have to define it for a bacteria. So there's no universal way to describe what a species is. There just is not. It's a fool's errand to try and find a universal definition for a species because biology is too messy. So that's why. Did you have a nice Canada Day? Yeah, my Canada Day was like most days. It's quarantine time, so there's not a whole lot of gatherings, but we visited some family. I've got 3 minutes, so if anyone has a final question for me that I can answer in 3 minutes, I will do that. Let's see. I'm now looking at the most recent questions, and there is a little bit of a lag, so it might take me a minute to get this last final question, but whoever you are, you lucky person, go ahead and write that question and send it, and I will do one more. Let me scroll back up and see. Oh, what is my favorite exaptation? There we go. That's a good question. My favorite exaptation. So an exaptation is where a structure that used to do something else is then co-opted into a new function to perform a new function over evolutionary time. I would have to say that my favorite exaptation is flight in birds. You have arms that are exapted into wings, and that is just the coolest thing ever. Actually, I'm going to change that. There's an even cooler one, but it's also wings. It's these, I'm forgetting what they're called, but they're these lizards that fly with their ribs. They stick their ribs out, and they can actually fly with them. They glide with them. And I forget the name of those things, but they're super cool. So yeah, it's between bird wings and lizard wings. They don't do true flight, these lizards, they just glide, but it's really amazing to see them just flick out their ribs and jump off of a branch and glide with extreme efficiency. So, yeah. Tim asks, what is the meaning of life? The meaning of life is to consume energy. Apparently, I mean, that's what natural selection is favoring, is organisms that can exploit new energy sources. Those are the things that get favored and do that more efficiently so that they can reproduce more efficiently. So yeah, I guess according to biology and physics, that's what the meaning of life is. But of course, hopefully you will find something more interesting to be the meaning that drives your life. It's so tempting to do more of these because people are coming out with really good questions now. Oh, it's the Draco lizard. Yeah. That's the flying one. Let's see here. What's my favorite animal? Well, that's the humpback whale, obviously. Can we explain lifespan of a species based on evolution? Yes. Sort of. Not very well. But basically our genes are under selection pressure to reproduce efficiently, and different environments select for different amounts of weighting between bouts of reproduction. And so that's kind of, there's not selection pressure for living forever. There's selection pressure for living until you can reproduce. and then living long enough to then help your offspring if you happen to be a species that's evolved the ability to help offspring. You need to be able to survive long enough to help those offspring become sufficient. So that's what selection pressure is favoring. And because of that, any mutation that causes us to die after we've reproduced will not really be selected against. It's just going to be there. And so we have an expiration date because of that. We reproduce, and then we help our offspring mature, and then we die. Do animals other than humans get depressed? Yes, all vertebrates get depressed, and they have the same receptors for the emotions evolved in depression. And we actually study depression on fish as a model for human depression for the study of antidepressants. And there's a group of researchers that are really good at spotting depression in zebrafish. They can actually see the outward, behavioral changes in a depressed zebrafish, and they can correlate that with biochemistry inside the zebrafish, and they study drugs for depression on those zebrafish. It's pretty amazing that happens. So yes, animals get depressed, and they can actually, like humans, it can cause them to die. They can get so depressed that they don't want to do anything, and they can die from that. It has been reported that dolphins will commit suicide due to depression, but those claims are a little bit sketchy. But dolphins are the only animal that I know of that has been reported to commit suicide due to depression. Male spiders know all about dying after reproduction. Yes, that's true. A lot of male spiders get eaten after they reproduce. How did emotion come in multicellular organisms? Nobody knows. What is the evolutionary basis for acne? I think it's just, I think it's a flaw. It's an accident. I don't think acne is an adaptation. But the fact that acne is embarrassing for people is probably due to sexual selection favoring clear, clean skin, because rashes and things like acne and so on are a cue indicating that the person who has it might not be good at avoiding parasites and so on. And so evolutionary psychologists think that there might be an evolved repulsion to acne and other conditions because of that. So there's actually selection pressure against acne, you would think. But acne is somehow slipping through the cracks anyways. And a lot of people have been trying to figure out what's causing acne, and it's people suspect that it might be linked to diet and a whole bunch of other things. So it is pretty mysterious, but I do not think it's being selected for. I actually think it's being probably slightly selected against. When do you see genuine rejuvenation anti-aging treatments hitting the market? I mean, you could say they already have. Like we already live way longer than we used to. So pretty much all of modern medicine, or a lot of modern medicine and modern nutrition science is anti-aging technology. But as far as stuff that can really like double our lifespan, I have no clue. So I'm going to end it there. Yeah, that was fun. This was, I honestly, I did this because I didn't have time this week to prepare anything, any lesson, and I didn't have a guest. I do have some cool guests lined up in the future, but everything is pending. I think next week I might, if I don't have a guest by next week, I'm probably going to do, sorry, I'm probably going to discuss this book here. This is an amazing book, The Machinery of Life, and it is about macromolecules and how they function inside the cell. And again, these are macromolecules. The really in-depth evolution of macromolecules was pretty hard to study until recently. Now that we can revive these old proteins through these new genetic techniques, we can really start to study the evolution of these things, and I'm very excited about that. But for the most part, we don't know how a lot of these things evolved, but this book just shows how they work, and it is amazing, and it shows just how crowded a cell is. A cell is way more crowded than you probably imagine it is, with all sorts of different things going on in there. And I'm going to go over that book. It's probably the best book I've ever read. It's definitely the best book I've ever read on microbiology, and or biochemistry rather. And I'm very excited about that. So that's probably what I'll be doing next week, unless one of these guests that I've been talking with decides to come on, or if next week is the week for them. So long for now. Stay curious.